It's not uncommon to find risks when playing a game. They add increased difficulty, create tense situations, and allow for a player to show off their gaming prowess. But on their own, the incentive to take those risks are few and far between. So to encourage players to engage in risky activities, they need to be enticed by some kind of reward. Enter the risk-reward scenario. This is how games tempt you to take risks by dangling a metaphorical carrot. But before I start talking about risks and rewards, it would help to understand exactly what a risk is. A risk is when the player engages in an activity that endangers them by some degree. This danger often comes in the form of uncertainty, which can be in the form of probability, facing an unknown situation, or even the player's own skill and whether or not they can accurately overcome a risky obstacle. After all, being unsure if you'll come out successful is what makes taking a risk so dangerous. Now, in my mind, there are 4 parts to every risk-reward scenario. The wager, which is what gets endangered should you be willing to take on a risk. The action, which is whatever the player does and how they initiate a risk. The deciding factor, which is how the success and failure of that risk takes form. And the reward, which is the benefit you receive for overcoming a risk. The wager is what you're guaranteed to lose should you come out on the wrong side of a risk-reward scenario. After all, you can hardly call it a risk if there's not something actually at risk. But what exactly does the player wager? It's not uncommon to see games endangering health or money when engaging in a risk, but as long as it's relevant, you could potentially wager anything. In a racing game, you can wager your vehicle's speed. In a shooter, you can wager your reload time. And in a roguelike, you can even wager an entire run attempt. You could even wager something more abstract, like value, which often shows up in games of chance. One example of that would be the spike doors in The Binding of Isaac. You can pass through these spike doors to collect whatever's on the other side, but it costs HP in order to go in and out, and there's no guarantee that whatever's past those doors is going to be any help to you. At first glance, the wager in this scenario would be the HP it takes to pass through the door, but you lose that HP regardless of what's beyond it, so that can't be what you stand to lose if the risk doesn't work out in your favor. Instead, the wager is the value of that lost health compared to the value of whatever's past the door. If what you find is utter trash, then your punishment is the lost value of the HP. Conversely, if you find something that's a boon to your run, the reward is the value of that treasure that exceeds the value of the lost health. Granted, the value of these things are somewhat left to personal interpretation, but that's true in most cases anyway. Wagers need not be limited to only one specific thing either. Take the risk-reward of Bayonetta's last-second dodge mechanic, which has you wagering your health since if you mistime a dodge, you take a hit from the enemy. But at the same time, taking damage lowers your post-battle performance ranking, making that one hit twice as impactful. When considering what to wager, you also need to determine how much to wager and where the best place to implement a wager is, since the 3 together dictate the danger level of a risk. For example, think of risks that wager time. Time is generally considered to be a low-risk wager since the player is only annoyed by failure rather than having a lasting consequence, like having a 30-second time loss for botching a hack attempt. It's annoying, but not much else. But if that time loss was in a game that had a time limit, it would be much more impactful as it would steal away your chances at success. Or if that time loss was much greater, like say having to wait an hour before reattempting a hack, which would certainly go beyond mere annoyance after failing. These things need to be managed carefully because you need to keep the danger level at a point that players still feel willing to take a risk. After all, if the players are endangering too much, then even given the reward, they may still avoid the risk, making its inclusion rather pointless. If need be, you can try and offset the danger through types of risk mitigation, which are ways to ease up on the danger without changing the base wager. In the game Crosscode, you can evade attacks by dashing away from them or blocking them, but you can also try and dash through attacks to avoid them, as the start of the dash grants brief invulnerability. This is the riskiest way to avoid taking damage, but you can mitigate that danger by equipping certain items, as certain skills and stats increase the length of that invulnerability, making it less dangerous to attempt. even though the potential health loss still exists. On that note, it's also good to make sure that both what and how much the player is wagering to take a risk is easily interpreted so the player can gauge if a risk is worth taking. This doesn't mean that you need to spell out the wager in writing every time, however. A logical understanding works just as well, such as parrying in Dark Souls. The gameplay alone shows that you'd risk taking health damage from an enemy should you fail a parry, and just the same, trying a parry on a boss should seem even more dangerous since bosses are set up to be even stronger than the enemies. It's simple and it makes sense. All risk-reward scenarios must also include a risk-taking action. This is both how the player initiates a risk and what your risk actually is. Using some of the earlier examples, I'll give that a bit more perspective. In Sonic and All-Stars Racing Transformed, I said you wager your speed, and the action is getting airborne and then choosing to do stunts or chain stunts together. In the Gears of War series, you can wager the time it takes to reload, and the action is hitting the reload button during an already occurring reload, and in Dead Cells, you wager your current run through the game, but the action is activating a curse and attempting to survive it by killing enough enemies. Get used to these examples, by the way, you'll be seeing them quite a few more times. Now, the reason that I combine both the risky action and how you initiate a risk is that in some situations, the two are equivocally the same, like spinning a roulette wheel, for instance. The action of spinning is both the start and finish of the player's involvement, and the initiate action can also have influence on the risky action in the form of an initial cost. The health cost from the Binding of Isaac I mentioned, or the stamina cost for the parry in Dark Souls, work in such a way. These costs are separate from wagers because they are used as barriers to engage in a risk or play a role in the action and are lost regardless of the risk's outcome. Conversely, you can also give out an initial benefit that gives the player something to lose. As for the risk-taking action itself, like the wagers, you have the option to turn almost anything you want into a risk. From using certain items in Fallout 4 to simply existing in an area too long and splunky, if a player can do it, you can turn it into a risk-related action. But you must also consider how to make the action risky. When I described what a risk was, I mentioned it had a lot to do with uncertainty. How you inject this uncertainty into a risk affects the way it plays out. Take the game Hand of Fate, which revolves around choosing cards that can help or hinder you on your quest. Unless you're a card-reading master, choosing one of the four is a simple game of chance. By using probability, or RNG as it's normally referred to in games, Hand of Fate allows for this risk to remain interesting forever, since each time you engage in the action, you never know what the outcome might be. But using probability means that your risky action is never quite as involved with the player, since the game ultimately decides the odds and the outcome. Limiting the player's knowledge is another way to add uncertainty. Taking an additional look at Poker Night 2, you have knowledge of your cards and the community cards to tell the strength of your hand, but you don't have knowledge of the other player's hands, so even if your hand is good, who knows if the other player's hands are better. By limiting information, you create risky situations where the player needs to make judgment based on their lack of knowledge and adapt to situations as information is revealed to them. You can also create risky actions based solely on skill. The uncertainty here comes from the player's own ability because success and failure depend on how sure the player is that they can overcome a risk. This type of uncertainty is the fairest for the player since they have full control over the outcome when compared to the other forms. After all, no matter how good a player is, they can't control probability or know things they cannot know. But while this method of uncertainty is the fairest, it also has a major drawback. If a player becomes too skilled and can successfully pull off the risk 100% of the time, then there is no more uncertainty, and therefore no risk. After all, a risk must have a chance for failure. This doesn't have to be a bad thing though. The Bayonetta series scores the player better after they successfully pull off that last-second dodge, so becoming that skilled could be considered the ultimate goal for an experienced player. But if you don't want the risky action to be skilled out of its usefulness, then combine the different forms of uncertainty together in different ways. Look at a game like Darkest Dungeon, whose main gameplay is a risk-reward feedback loop where you take a team of heroes on an expedition and wager their lives to try and earn treasure and gain levels. The risky action here is surviving the expedition and completing its objective, while taking on all manner of enemies along the way. This game mixes all the uncertainty types I've mentioned. You have a lack of knowledge as each attempt is filled with a random assortment of enemies and traps. You can utilize your skill to take down enemies in the most efficient manner and keep your team sustained between fights, and all battles contain probability for the accuracy of attacks. Certain skill activations and critical hits are based on chance. Using these three types at once and to such an extent may be necessary for Darkest Dungeon, but that's hardly the norm, and there are other ways to add uncertainty to risky actions. These three types are simply the most prevalent. Following the action is the deciding factor, which dictates the outcome, be it success or failure. The reason that this is separate from the action is that there doesn't have to be one way to succeed or fail a risk. For Dead Cells' curse, there is a binary deciding factor since it causes instant death when taking damage. Either you survive the curse and succeed, or you die to the curse and fail. But for the other two examples I keep going back to, the deciding factor isn't binary. For Gears of War's active reload, failing occurs when the player hits the reload button too soon or too late during a reload progress bar. But hitting the reload button in the light gray area on the progress bar results in a quick reload, and hitting it in the small white section of the progress bar results in a perfect reload. And in Sonic and All-Stars Racing Transformed, success occurs when landing after pulling off a stunt, but you fail when hitting the ground mid-stunt or when attempting multiple stunts in succession much too quickly. Allowing for different measures of success and failure can create much more interesting outcomes and even push the player to take risks in very different or very specific ways. In the case of Sonic and All-Stars Racing Transformed, having multiple ways to fail pushes the player to use their stunts in a more singular method that considers timing and height, since doing stunts too low to the ground makes you fail, and spamming them repeatedly when you have a lot of hang time also results in failure. The player is guided to making well thought out stunts based on how high a given jump is, and doing so with a good sense of timing. But for Gears of War, the multiple levels of success let the player choose their own difficulty and make the decision to try for one or the other based on the situation. Not to mention that since the two bars are attached to each other, failing a perfect reload by hitting the button too late will still result in a quick reload, thereby creating a pseudo-safety net. The game Shovel Knight even includes a method that allows for a player to forfeit their success for greater rewards. The risk-reward scenario here is that the player wagers the time it takes to go through a level, the action is smashing a checkpoint and proceeding through the level, the deciding factor is whether or not you make it to the next checkpoint, and your reward is keeping the money from the initial breaking of the checkpoint. The deciding factor of making it to the next checkpoint need not be the end of the risk, because once you reach that checkpoint, you can choose, again, to smash it to pieces for money, but now failing would take you back even further, upping the level of danger. Unlike the safety net of the active reload's multiple successes, Shovel Knight allows you to shatter your safety net by pushing your success further and further away. Beyond success and failure, there is also a third option that leads to its own outcome. Consider the game Vermintide 2. The risk-reward scenario that can be done here is picking up one of these Skaven grimoires, then trying to beat the level with its health penalties so that you can acquire better loot upon level completion. The deciding factor is either completing the level and succeeding, or dying and failing. Or there is another option. At any point in the level, you can choose to permanently throw away the grimoire, remove the health penalties, and complete the level normally. You didn't die, so you technically didn't fail, but you didn't complete the level with the grimoire either. You've simply returned to the point before ever picking up the grimoire in the first place. This isn't success or failure, it's risk abandonment. Obviously, some risky actions cannot include a form of this, but it should be considered when you can. Risk abandonment lets the player save their skins when they've gotten in over their heads. Remember way back when I was talking about wagers and warned that making a player risk too much will stop them from engaging in a risk-reward scenario? Well, if the player has an emergency exit, such wagers don't seem so distressing. That said, including a form of risk abandonment needs a little more consideration before implementing it. Think of the risky hacking minigames in Fallout 3, which when failed, permanently locks you out of bypassing the security. In reality, this should be a serious risk because it's a permanent lockout. But at any point in the minigame, you can back out, then restart before you fail, essentially giving you infinite attempts. And that's to say nothing of reloading a previous save. If you can retry as much as you want until you succeed with no danger of being locked out, then is there really any risk at all? No, not really. So consider adding a penalty to risk abandonment. Darkest Dungeon, in keeping true to its theme of suffering, has your units receive mental damage when retreating mid-expedition. But hey, it's still better than all of them dying, and it has more impact than a simple leave level, immediately retry situation. Just make sure that the penalty loss doesn't exceed that of the wager, otherwise there's not much point to risk abandonment, because no one will choose to abandon if the penalty is worse than just failing normally. If the wager is the shadow of loss that surrounds you, then the reward is the light at the end of the tunnel. Rewards are essential to the risk-reward scenario. Without any gainful incentives, a risk is nothing more than a difficulty spike. When considering how much reward to give, you should try and keep it balanced in relation to the amount that the player could lose from the wager and the difficulty of the action itself. So if the player wagers little and the action is not so tough, then make the reward rather small. And if the player wagers a lot and the action is extremely difficult, then make the reward big and worthwhile. Otherwise, if the wager is big and the action easy, or the wager small but the action hard, keep the reward floating in the middle. Disrupting this balance can lead to unsavory situations, like making a risk feel almost compulsory when the reward is big but the danger small, or having players avoid a risk because the danger is high and the reward too small. An example of these is Dead Cell's instant death curse, but only under certain circumstances. A normal setting would be at the beginning of a run, where you're not too far from the start, so deciding to smash a door and get the curse isn't super impactful, because you're losing little time if you fail, and enemies are rather simple, so removing the curse isn't that hard. This can take a different turn much later in the game. You can stumble across cursed chests when nearing the latter part of a run. These chests drop a few items of interest, but considering that the enemies are much harder and you stand to lose 20 to 30 minutes of playtime if you die, those few rewards hardly seem worth it. On the flip side, you could run into one of these chests when you're already one hit from death, which renders the risk moot and gives you a huge incentive to take the treasure because it might just help you survive. This is also a great example of how the risk-reward scenario can change depending on the different systems that any given game has. As for what you can actually reward the player with, and at the risk of sounding like a broken record, like the wager, you can reward the player with anything that is relevant to the game. You can have the reward be the same as the wager, like how Sonic and All-Stars Racing Transformed wagers speed and rewards you with speed, or make them completely different, such as Kid Icarus Uprising letting you wager money, or hearts as they call it, but rewards you with a higher loot quality. And, like the wagers, you can have multiple rewards, like Gears of War's Active Reload, where pulling off the perfect reload rewards you not only with the shortest reload time, but also boosts your bullet damage as indicated by the flashing ammo clip. The reward doesn't need to be tangible either. Quite a few games simply reward you with achievements acting as a badge of honor. Aside from that, it's not as if your wager and reward need to be mutually exclusive. In the game Flinthook, you can choose to challenge dangerous treasure rooms where you need to bypass difficult hazards to reach a chest at the other end. But it's not as if taking damage in that room means that you need to restart it. You can simply push forward, taking as much damage as you can handle until you get to the treasure. The wager just compounds the more you screw up, and that can have a larger effect later on. Which brings me to a different topic. One other thing that should be considered isn't part of the risk-reward scenario, but rather what happens after it. The outcome, be it success or failure, can have an impact on the game beyond what you've gained or lost. In the game 20XX, going through a gauntlet can reward you with a new weapon, which is great on its own, but that new weapon might be the difference between the rest of the game being a difficult slog or plowing through all your opponents with ease. The reward shifts the difficulty of everything beyond that point. The same can happen with suffering a loss, just in the opposite direction. And there can be a lot more after effects depending on how many different systems are in a game. Take opening a treasure chest in Metal Gear Survive. It's a low danger risk-reward scenario. You only wager time in an attempt to get loot by doing a little minigame. But the potential dangers if you fail can branch out in a lot of different ways. The reason being that when you fail the minigame, the lever you're pulling lets out a loud metallic screech. If enemies are in the vicinity, they will rush towards the sound, so now you have to fight, which can cause you to lose more time, lose valuable ammunition, cause weapon decay, you could take damage, sustain a serious injury, die and lose all your resources. There's also the persistent decay of max health and stamina, so you'll lose that. And if you're in certain areas, you'll also have oxygen loss and have to worry about wasting too much time and suffocating, all just because you held the R button a fraction of a second too long. Now, realistically, all that won't happen. If there are any enemies around, you'll just kill them and return to opening the chest, but the point is, all those things could happen, and that's why the after effects of a risk-reward scenario need to be taken into consideration. These potential outcomes need not be random either. The metallic screech of the lever is by all means an intentional outcome, but it stands separate from the wager because while the wager is what's guaranteed to be lost, the attraction of enemies is a potential danger that will only occur under certain circumstances. By including potential dangers or even potential rewards, you allow for a risk-reward scenario to dynamically change based on the current state of the game. But I would not recommend letting the risk-reward scenario only include potential outcomes, because without a cemented gain and loss, there arises situations where you only have a risk or only have a reward, rendering the whole scenario pointless. Now, why analyze the risk-reward structure in such a manner? The reason is that it seems like the average description of a risk-reward scenario is, does it have a risk, and does it give you a reward? And this leads to some misconceptions about what types of gameplay actually function as a risk-reward scenario. Stat trade-offs are a great example. For instance, items that make you both do and take more damage would make sense. You risk losing more health, and you're rewarded with extra damage. But if analyzed more deeply, you wager health, your reward is more damage, and the action is equipping such an item and heading into battle. The deciding factor is what doesn't exist here. It might seem like taking a hit results in failure, so you receive the extra damage, and hitting an enemy is a success because your opponent receives more damage. But that results in the game acting like this.
Success, failure, success, failure.
This is a situation where success and failure are occurring continuously with no real conclusion. So it not being a risk-reward scenario makes sense because those shifts in damage are just a form of rebalancing that makes the game riskier by increasing the danger for you, but also makes the game less risky by defeating enemies faster. Or how about situations that have false risks? Using the slot machine in Chasm would seem like you risk a token and then try to line up slots for a reward, but with the more in-depth analysis, you're actually wagering the value of the token, the action is using the slot machine, the deciding factor is what you line up, and the reward is the value of what you get compared to the value of the token. Without thinking about it like this, you would never realize that the token itself has no value. Its only use is being put in the slot machine. You get nothing if you save the tokens, and you get nothing if you fail the slot machine. With no wager, there is no risk-reward scenario, even though you are technically risking a token. And this method of analysis can also point out risk-reward scenarios that perhaps went unnoticed, like every single Pokemon trainer battle, for instance. On its face, the average trainer battle wouldn't seem like one, but if analyzed, you can see that you wager money, the reward is also money, the action is engaging in battle with another trainer, and the deciding factor is success if you KO the opponent's team, and failure if your team gets KO'd. This risk-reward scenario is hidden by the sheer number of times it occurs, but you do endanger your own money with each encounter. Now, I'm not saying this is the perfect way to analyze a risk-reward scenario, but I think it does break it down into a more observable way. The wager is what you lose, the reward is what you gain, the action is how you play, and the deciding factor determines the outcome. Breaking it down like this shows how the scenario works and how the danger is designed. And if seeing it like this helps make a better risk-reward scenario that can create greater feelings of tension, more interesting challenges to overcome, and an overall better game, then I'd say it's served its purpose.
Salty! Chunky too! Haha, bonus!